everyone, welcome to the McMaster Bootcamp on the supplementary application. Today we're going to walk you through question number 3. Now, unlike question 1 and 2, the candidates all have to answer the same question for question number 3, which is why it's equally important that you try to differentiate your answer as much as possible, and you use some of the tips and tools that we're providing in this video as you're crafting your response. This question is focused on how to solve a problem. Essentially, you're going to be given a large amount of data, and the situation is presented to you through a narrative based on a research study, and you're going to have to formulate an explanation for the data that's being presented. So let's get down to it. Essentially, what we're going to be talking about today is we did a quick overview of in the supplementary application video. We went through some common things that you should be looking for when you're first approaching this question, whether it be observations that you should be making about the research bars, the obesity index, any relevant information that's given to you, or even going beyond the information that's given to you, and asking some further questions about things that are different, things that don't make sense, any assumptions that you're looking to make. One key area that we can point to right now is just looking at that asterisk that's showing error or error bars in the variability of your data. This is something that you want to look further into to try to understand what the data is being presented to you and what that means for your overall conclusion and hypothesis. But don't worry, we're going to walk you through all of this as we go through the module. So how do you structure your thinking to solve this problem? That's essentially what we hope you get out of this module today. This question is quite daunting at first glance, and it's riddled with a large amount of ambiguity. But once you start to structure your thinking and you approach the problem in a logical manner and you follow the steps that we've kind of outlined in the video, you'll find that it's quite easy to solve. So following the advice of Steve Jobs, if you're defining the problem correctly, then there in itself, you'll be able to find the solution. And if you're successful in seeking admission to the McMaster Health Sciences program, this won't be the first time that you'll see a problem like this. This type of question is called a RAPSI or a TRIPSI. So a rapid problem-solving exercise or a tripartite problem-solving exercise. And you're going to encounter this a lot, whether it's your first-year cell biology class or some of the other courses that you take as you move through your undergraduate degree. The objective of these exercises is just to stimulate a scientific process. So scientists they start with information that's incomplete and puzzling, and they have to frame hypotheses and explanations for that with the limited information that's kind of given to them. And then once they have that, they have to follow that by designing kind of an experimental test to gain further information and draw conclusions that they could present to their peers to review. So in this question, they're really just testing the first part of that skill, which is how can you take limited information and formulate relevant and accurate hypotheses given a set of data. Some key things before we dive in we want you to think about is that there's no singular answer that's correct. However, there is a range of answers with varying degrees of plausibility and credibility. That's correct depending on how you support your answer. You can be creative and out of the box. That's definitely not discouraged, but you want your responses to be validated and backed up. There's no special evaluation criteria for this question. You're going to be using the same thing that the committee is going to be using the same thing that they've been evaluating for all of the other questions, which is you are fit for the program. And whether you can demonstrate thinking and show intellectual curiosity, be a methodological problem solver, a good communicator. Because there can be more than one answer for this question, that's why it's so important that you demonstrate your logic and your thinking. So the person that's marking your answer can understand the framework of how you got there. They care a lot about your process just as much as they care about your response. Always provide evidence or reasoning for why you hold your answer to be true and state any assumptions that you made throughout the process. These questions are riddled with information. Some are relevant and others not so much. So a great approach when it comes to figuring out a good process and figuring out what information is important is just look at, the information that's kind of given to you versus trying to figure out what information you might need to do some further research on or things that you feel are gaps. So an example would be for me is that, I don't know too much about the obesity index. Like, how is it measured? Like, what does it mean? And you're going to have to also be comfortable being able to make some decisions, not knowing all the facts, just the facts that are kind of given to you at that time. Here's a quick review checklist of what we expect for you to kind of look for when you're evaluating the quality of your responses for question 3. I don't want to focus too much on it right now, as we'll get back to it closer to the end of the module, giving you some tips and tricks on things to consider when you're looking at giving yourself a score for your response and evaluating whether your response is high quality and great for submission for the program. So here is a high-level overview on how to structure question number 3. It is important that you define the problem, you identify what you know, and perhaps even think about some things that you don't know when you're coming up with that hypothesis. In this case, what are the possible answers for what the labels for bar A and B can be? And once you have those hypotheses, you want to be able to prioritize one and recommend a solution or a suggested answer. In an experimental setting, you might design an experiment to validate your hypothesis. In this case, we're just going to use the facts that are given to us and some assumptions that we made to support why we believe that hypothesis is correct. So this is a part of the exercise in terms of defining the problem where you're setting the boundaries for the problem and its component elements. You've been given a page of information regarding this graph. So let's start picking out some relevant facts, some information gaps, distinct issues. You can use a number of tools or methods to kind of approach defining the problem. We're going to walk you through one way, which is using an issue or a logic tree. But before we dive into that logic tree, like I said, it's important to first summarize the information that's kind of given to you, information that's not given to you in the text, and any corresponding questions or observations that you have. Why is this important? Because as a scientist, you're always going to be given mass amounts of data and information, and not all of it is going to be relevant. And in this case, it isn't. So you're going to have to parse out that relevant data and identify what you're going to need to be able to ask those broader questions of, eventually, how do you build that hypothesis that you want to test? And we'll walk you through different kind of tools and techniques and tables that you can use to make that whole process easier. So the first thing is, what are some strategies you can use to absorb information from a large body of text? This is not a skill you're just going to need in STEM, but it's universally applicable. So use the 3 to 4 read rule, and with each progressive read, you can focus on extracting more information and more details, and do a deeper analysis of the information that's kind of being given to you. You can use different approaches when you're kind of collecting information and categorizing it. You can read silently, you can read out loud, you can underline words, you can highlight in different colors, you can use notations to kind of remind you of things you should go back to. One thing I like to do is always I use the question mark, and I put a question mark on the sheet if I think I need to do some further research on it. Don't get too lost in asking too many theoretical questions. Focus on the information that is being given to you. It's okay to do some follow-up research and, be intellectually curious. You just don't want to fall in a rabbit hole, and we want to make sure that you stay on point and actually answer the question that's being asked to you by the committee. So one of the first things you can do when you're first reading is read through the scenario. Don't worry about taking any notes. When you're on the second read, underline, circle, or highlight some key facts that are kind of being given to you. When you're on the third read, now try to identify some unknowns or some incomplete information that's being presented, because by now you should have a good idea of the entire context of the text. And by the fourth question, you should be asking questions about things that you want to know more about. So here is an example of a table that you can create to kind of map down some of the information that's given, some of the information that's not given, and some observations. This is obviously a template based on my interpretation of the data. You may have your own interpretation, and you may extract your own information about A and B and the study that was being done. So if I can just quickly walk through it. So here, I think some of the key information pieces that are given that we need to focus on is, what the topic is, which is, food security and children's health, what the before and after state are, and what's the time elapsed between that before and after state. How does the study present the two neighborhoods that's being given, so Gritzberg and the Haitian Courtier. Which one is, defined as a little bit more healthy. One's given more access to parks, more green spaces, and the other one is riddled with fast food joints, not such a healthy place. One is more of an affordable neighborhood than the other. We're also looking at changes in the obesity index. That's the trend that's being observed between A and B. And then we have some error bars. That's one standard deviation. What does that mean? What's the significance of that? We don't really know that yet. And that's something that we can further research. Information that's not given is we don't really know what the metrics of the obesity index is. Typically, it is a ratio or a proportion of weight to height, but we can't be sure. We don't know the age range of the children, whether they're infants, they're adolescents, or preschoolers. We don't know the average discretionary income of the households. We don't know the ethnic or racial distribution of the households that contributed towards the trends. We have no idea what the size of the data set is, how many children are actually being measured, no gender information, and again, not a lot of information about what the data variability does mean by the error bars that are kind of presented. Some key observations that we made, which is going to be really important when you build out that logic tree, is that bar A increases in obesity index while bar B decreases. As we move through neighborhoods, the index change in bar A is ranged between 0.5 to 2. Again, without really understanding the metrics of the obesity index, you don't really know what the significance of the values of those numbers could be. Bar A has a higher obesity index compared to that of bar B again, between the after and the before state, and the opposite is true for bar B. And there's a higher variability in data in bar B, in the before and after. And this is also an opportunity for you to state any assumptions that you're making. So an important one that we're obviously making, given the text that's presented, is that the Haitian Courtier neighborhood is much healthier, given their access to healthier food outlets, their green spaces, activity centers, parks. So this is a part of the exercise, which is step 2, which is formulating a hypothesis. So, you've defined the boundaries of the problems, and now you're going to use the information that you collected by reading the text and be able to build out that logic tree or that issue tree. So a logic tree or an issue tree is just a vertical visualization of the problem. That captures all the component breakdowns of that problem. And it's just easy to map and look at, and it shows you what your hypothesis can be in a logical manner. Some of the key rules for a logic tree is, as you branch out from left to right, you want to make sure that you're constantly asking your question the why, and that your details are getting finer as you're moving more towards the right. Some key rules is we always apply the MECE rule, which is, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. So, each branch is something different, but you have exhausted all your possibilities of, what those different branches can be while you're building that out. If you have trouble getting started, which, for someone who's never done a logic tree before, it can be, we kind of recommend, start with the original question and then branch out into observations and then branch out into why you see those observations happening. So in this case, we started with what are the possible labels for A and B. We noted our 3 key observations that we got from that table that we built. And then we started thinking about, so why is that the case? So why would the case of the obesity index of A increase while it decreases for B? Could it be different income levels as we're moving through the neighborhoods? Could it be stress or emotional factors? Could it be access to healthier food? And we did those same observations, or those same, assigning of factors for the other 2 observations. So in the case of why the initial obesity index for bar A is lower than that of bar B, it could be tied to racial identity, gender, genetics, and why the final obesity index for bar B is lower than that of bar A, it could be tied to age and physical activity. Other things that we want to consider is also where would kind of education and schooling kind of fit into this? Where would government promotions and health information campaigns allow us to kind of think about people's access to healthier food, but also their kind of willingness to know about that this is the type of food that they should be eating to live a healthy, active lifestyle. let's start thinking about neighborhoods and the layouts of these neighborhoods. Like, where are these parks located? Where are these supermarkets located? Does that change between one neighborhood to another? Again, we don't have all that information, but that is an assumption that we can make or factor in while we're building out our responses. There is also opportunities for you to think about how one of these factors could also be a factor in another observation. So, access to healthier food, stress, emotional factors, and income level. It can be also applicable to the other two observations. And another approach you can look at for the logic tree is seeing where there's overlap of these factors, if you choose to kind of double down, which I didn't. And that can help you build out your stronger hypothesis based on the number of overlaps that you see. There are quite a few amount of challenges that come with a question like this. One is that there is a range of possible explanations for the data, and it's all based on your perspective. And there can be one set of can there be one set of labels to explain all three observations? That's something that you have to explore as you're building out your supporting arguments. There are a lot of unknown variables, and there's no real understanding of what the control variables are. So you don't, again, have an understanding of the sample size, the ages of the children, and any other information about metrics to help you kind of understand control in this data set. And you're building conclusions based on an incomplete data set and assumptions that you made. So there is a certain level of reasoning and argument validation that you need to complete, and McMaster Health Sciences definitely makes it challenging for you with that incomplete information. But like we said, a strategy that you can use is really just narrow your focus, formulate a hypothesis that you think makes sense to you following your logic, and find supporting facts to kind of validate that argument. So in my case, one of the approaches that I did is, while there's many different observations or different configurations for the data, my primary focus is to look at explaining why there was a change in the data between A and B, what that change was, and what factors could have contributed towards that, and that led to my understanding of what the labels for A and B can be. A secondary validation technique that I would use is then, once I figured out the labels for A and B based on that initial observation, I'd try to map it against observation 2 and 3, which is talking about the initial and the final obesity, and see if the labels make sense. So using my logics tree, when I'm thinking about formulating a hypothesis, I also want to think about my initial work and background research that I did in terms of the differences in the neighborhood, the time elapsed, the information about food and the infrastructure in these neighborhoods. And as I'm building my supporting argument, I want to see if that makes sense. So here's just a quick recap of the statement of facts and unknowns and observations and assumptions that we made, which is going to be very helpful when we build out our supporting argument tables. So based on the area that I wanted to focus on, I picked 3 hypotheses and I developed that. And again, these have variant levels of credibility, and we'll see that as we build out that supporting argument structure. In the end, I want to be able to prioritize the hypothesis that I think fits best based on the logic and the perspective that I want to take. I also want to try to see if this hypothesis fits with the other 2 observations that I made in my logic tree. So in this case, I think A and B could be either varying income levels of the parents of the children being studied. They could be various age groups of the children being studied, whether they're an infant, a youth, or a teenager. Or it could be the different proximity in kilometers to the grocery store and the supermarket. And now it's time for me to validate my hypothesis by finding those supporting arguments. So I built out 3 different examples for you guys to see in these modules, but I'll just walk through this one so you get an understanding of where kind of the information is coming from. So like we said, we want you to reference the information table that you built out with the information given, the information not given, assumptions that you made, and be able to kind of build out a rational set of arguments that makes sense for why A and B could be the varying income levels. So one of the first things I would do is assign the labels for A and B, but then kind of break it down more specifically to the factor that I've chosen. So in this case, I said A could be representative of children with parents with household incomes below $50,000. B is representative children with parents who have household income below 100,000. And then I choose to kind of define what A and B could be in the before and the after state given this factor. So in the before state, I'm kind of saying higher income households have more spending power to regularly buy food compared to lower income households. I'm assuming that the higher income households are buying more fast food than the lower income households. And then when I talk about the after state, I'm saying, the lower income households have lower spending power because we know from the text that the affordability of the houses are much more challenging. That means, they have a lot less discretionary income to spend. And in the higher income households, we're saying that, they have slightly smaller spending power because, again, the housing costs have gone up. And because of that, they're choosing to kind of spend more money on buying groceries than buying fast food. Another kind of connection or observation I'm making is in the after state, I'm saying, lower income households are stressed about the affordability of their house. So, they have less choice about their healthier meals and they're just stressed about their financial state. And we know from research that there's an association between stress and increase in the obesity index due to cortisol production. So all of these different arguments, they're supporting my initial hypothesis that the A and B could be the variant levels of income of the children's parents. And so far, there is no discrepancy or there's no kind of supporting argument that's saying that that's not true. But as we move through the different examples, so this is another example with the age groups, and again, we follow the same exercise. We define what A and B is, we define what that means for the before and after state, and then we try to explain why the trends are happening that we're seeing. But if we go to the third one that we've built out, which is the proximity to food outlets, you can see that in my last point, I say that, there's an inconsistent explanation for why there's an increase in obesity index for data bar A, given that the distance to the grocery store is the same between the before and the after state. And the children have now moved to you would think, a perceived healthier neighborhood with healthier access to food. So if the distance to the food outlets stay the same, and we assume that the children have moved to a healthier food market and have access to healthier food, then why aren't we seeing a change in the obesity index to reflect that? So there's an inconsistency there, and that would make me believe that this is not a strong hypothesis and not something that I would write about when I'm formulating my final conclusion. So now that you've kind of gone through the different kind of tables, what we're looking at is you've analyzed all the data, you've figured out what A and B could be, you have a logical thought process. Now, how do you communicate that in 1,200 characters? That's a challenging task. So there are many pieces of information you include, but the key is to be concise and clear with your response. They don't want to know all the possible explanations for what the data could be. They just want to know one possible explanation that makes sense, given your analysis and given your experiences. So focus on your strongest hypothesis and find supporting arguments to ensure that you build a logical thought process for it. So we're just going to take you back to remind you of the writing style that is recommended for this question, which is answer first, communicate second. You want to make sure your key message is out there and then follow that up with supporting details. And this is especially important for question 3. Some common pitfalls that we see with a lot of our students is, they want to try to explain all the data. They take a more storytelling approach with the data. They have long-winded answers. They're not quite clear in the point that they're trying to make. And you want to make sure that, the Supplementary Application Committee, which is made up of faculty staff, administration staff, fourth-year students, they're essentially, the single biggest thing they're looking for is your fit for the program. And as we mentioned, some of the competencies in the earlier modules, it means that you want to demonstrate that you can solve problems, that you can communicate your thinking, and that you're an intellectual, curious person. And you want to make sure you do that in a clear, concise, and logical manner. So we're going to provide you with a template to follow and a guide for how you would write your response. But again, you can customize that for your perspective and your hypothesis that you've developed. So here it's really important that you demonstrate insightful thinking. you want to make sure that the committee member doesn't say like, hey, like I've seen this answer dozens of times. And it's easy to do that because every single question that is applying, every single, student that is applying to this program is going to be answering this question. As we said, there is no choice between option A and B like the previous questions. So you want to make sure that you really differentiate yourself. So a common kind of framework that you've seen before with some of our earlier modules is, answer, find that concise rationale, state your supporting arguments, tie it back. With this specific question, we want your answer to first state what your interpretation of A and B is going to be. State some things that you see, like the time elapsed between the variables, between the before and after state. When you get to stating your concise reasoning, make sure you state the trend that you see between the before and after, and then explain why you believe your interpretation to be true. Why is your hypothesis of these labels the strongest? And make sure that if you think your interpretation is the same as another applicant, that you elevate your thinking and try to be unique. So when we get to the supporting arguments, this is when you would use the observations from the logic tree, the table of facts, the hypothesis validation tables, any personal examples or experiences that you have that you can connect to your answer. Maybe you've done some work in the community, maybe you've observed some things in the community that may explain these obesity trends. We don't want you to veer off too much from the data being presented, but you can kind of say that this is the perspective I've had, given the experience that I have. Like I said, there's a lot of variant answers. There's not a lot of information given to you. So you do have to kind of build your own case, and the perspective that you choose to kind of put on that is based on your own set of experiences and your own research. And we want to make sure that at the end you're tying it back to the original question and that you've answered the question, which is restating your argument for what you think those labels are, and that you don't want to start a new hypothesis or a new train of thought, but you're staying on course with what you presented, and you're just confirming that at the end with your supporting arguments. So as we go back to that checklist that we brought up earlier in the module, just some tips that we want you to follow. When you're thinking about creativity or the uniqueness of your answer, we want to make sure you're differentiating your answer. So think about whether you think other students would have the same answer as you. I also wouldn't recommend just following the module and using the answers that I presented to you. This is meant to be a thought starter, and getting you to think about what these responses can be. But considering the students that are watching these modules, we want to make sure that you're not just using the answers in these modules, but you are elevating your thinking and going beyond what's presented in this module. And we want you to try to cite real-world examples of knowledge of local communities that you have, demonstrate current events, anything that can shape your thinking beyond why you see these data trends happening in obesity indexes. Like we said in Explore, some of the factors that could have contributed towards that is, genetics, racial identities, like age, physical activity. Do you have any understanding of any of those elements given your own experience so far? The third thing is we're looking at the degree of, when you've asked the why, the so what in your main thesis. This all stems from that logic tree. So have you deepened your level of thinking of the hypothesis beyond just the surface level? Have you asked the whys enough to get to the root of your answer? And the last one is we want to really focus that your answer is logically structured, leveraging like an answer first communication method. So we want you to follow the template that we have, and make sure that your writing is simple, not overly complicated, making sure it's easier to read for the reader. So the last thing we want to talk about is just after watching this module, if you feel that you need additional support, consider signing up for our Essential and our Premium package. That gives you the opportunity to work with our coaches via email, one-on-one. Or you can gain additional support in just crafting that response to your McMaster supplementary application. There are only limited spots available, so if you are interested, we recommend going to their website and learning more to sign up. And we hope that you've gained a lot from our bootcamp today, and that it's given you an opportunity to really reflect on question number 3. Think about ways that you can differentiate yourself and have a thought starter, or know where to start in terms of crafting your response. So thanks for joining us today, and we hope to hear from you soon.